Chapter 9: Liberalism and its Metamorphosis. In 1932, the German National Bolshevik, Ernst Niekisch, whose ideas were remarkably similar to both the Russian National Bolsheviks and the Eurasianists, wrote a book with a revealing title, Hitler, Disaster for Germany. The book went almost unnoticed, but after a few years led him straight to the concentration camps. He turned out to be absolutely right. Hitler had, in fact, appeared to be precisely such a fateful figure for Germany. Fateful, meaning not accidental, well-founded, ingrained in the course of things, joined with the logic of fate, but embodying her darker aspects. And in this book, as in others of his works, Niekisch repeated, in human society there are no fatalities such as those inherent in nature, the changing of the seasons, natural disasters. The dignity of man consists in the fact that he can always say no. He can always rebel. He can always rise and fight against even that which seems inevitable, absolute, and unbeatable. And even if he loses, he gives an example to others, and others take his place, and others say no. That's why the most fateful and fated occurrences can be defeated with the strength of the soul. Niekisch fought against Nazism and the Nazis, and predicted earlier and more precisely than most others what would be the consequences of their bloody rule for Germany and mankind. He did not give up. He threw down a challenge to, quote, evil fate, not putting down his fists. Most importantly, he resisted a strength that seemed invincible with a handful of like-minded anti-Nazis. A group of Niekisch's followers, one of them the National Bolshevik Harold Schulze-Boysen, became the core of the Red Orchestra. It was him, almost blind by then, that the Soviet troops freed from a concentration camp in 1945. He did not see the physical victories for which he had gave his life, but until the end of his days he remained convinced that it is necessary to stand opposed to the evil fate of human history, even if it arises from its deepest flywheels. Today, the same could be said about liberalism as an ideology, which was victorious in the West and which spreads its influence, using many old and new methods, across the entire world, supported by superpower number one, the United States. It seems once again that this might is inevitable, not accidental, and follows the same fundamental fateful law which seems to suggest that to argue with this power is useless. But again, as in the case of Ernst Niekisch, people are found who are ready to carry out that same program, only this time not as regarding a separate country, but rather all mankind. Liberalism is the evil fate of human civilization. The battle with it, opposition to it, and refutation of its poisonous dogmas, this is the moral imperative of all honest people on the planet. At all costs, we must, argumentatively and thoroughly, again and again, repeat that truth, even when to do so seems useless, untimely, politically incorrect, and sometimes even dangerous. Liberalism as a summary of Western civilization and its definition. In order to adequately understand the essence of liberalism, we must recognize that it is not accidental, that its appearance in the history of political and economic ideologies is based on fundamental processes preceding in all of Western civilization. Liberalism is not only a part of that history, but its purest and most refined expression, its result. This principal observation demands from us a stricter definition of liberalism. Liberalism as a political and economic philosophy and ideology embodying in itself the most important force lines of the modern age and of the epoch of modernity. It consists of the understanding of the individual as the measure of all things, the belief in the sacred character of private property, the assertion of the equality of opportunity as the moral law of society, the belief in the contractual basis of all socio-political institutions, including governmental. The abolition of any governmental, religious, and social authorities who lay claim to the quote, common truth. The separation of powers and the making of social systems of control over any government institution whatsoever. The creation of a civil society without races, peoples, and religions in place of traditional governments. The dominance of market relations over other forms of politics. The certainty that the historical path of Western peoples and countries is a universal model of development and progress for the entire world, which must, in an imperative order, be taken as the standard and pattern. It is specifically these principles which lie at the base of historical liberalism, developed by the philosophers Locke, Mill, Kant, and later, Bentham and Constance, right up to the neoliberal school of the 20th century, such as Friedrich Hayek and Karl Popper. Adam Smith, the follower of Locke, on the basis of the ideas of his teacher, analyzed business activity and laid the foundations for political economy, having written the political and economic Bible of the modern epoch. Freedom from. The principles of the philosophy of liberalism and the very name liberalism are based on the thesis of freedom equals liberty. At the same time, the liberal philosophers, in particular Mill, underscore that the freedom they stand for is a strictly negative freedom. Moreover, they separate freedom from and freedom to, and suggest using for these things the two different English words, liberty and freedom. Liberty implies freedom from something. It is from here that the name liberalism is derived. Liberals fight for this freedom and insist on it. As for, quote, freedom to, that is the meaning and goal of freedom, here liberals fall silent, reckoning that each individual can himself find a way to apply his freedom, or that he can neglect altogether to search for a way to use it. That is a question of private choice, which is not discussed and which has no political or ideological value. On the other hand, quote, freedom from is defined precisely and has a dogmatic character. Liberals propose to be free from the government and its control over the economy, politics, and civil society, freedom from churches and their dogmas, freedom from class systems, freedom from any form of common areas of responsibility for the economy, freedom from any attempt to redistribute with one or another government or social institution the results of material and non-material labor, freedom from ethnic attachments, freedom from any collective identity whatsoever. One can think that we have some version of anarchy here, but that is not exactly right. Anarchists, at least those like Proudhon, consider as an alternative to government free communal labor with a complete collectivization of its products, and they come out strongly against private ownership, while liberals, on the other hand, see in the market and in the sacredness of private property a pledge for the realization of their optimal socioeconomic model. Besides, theoretically considering that the government must sooner or later die out, opening up a place for the world market and world civil society, liberals, for pragmatic reasons, support the government if it is bourgeois democratic, facilitates the development of the market, guarantees to civil society safety and protection against aggressive neighbors, and staves off the, quote, war of all against all. In everything else, liberals go rather far, repudiating practically all socio-political institutions right up to the family and sexual differentiation. In extreme cases, liberals support not only the freedom of abortions, but even the freedom from sexual differentiation, supporting the rights of homosexuals, transsexuals, and so on. The family, as another form of society, is thought by them to be a purely contractual thing, which, as with other enterprises, is conditioned by legal agreements. On the whole, liberals insist not only on freedom from tradition and sacrality, but even on freedom from socialization and redistribution, on which leftists socialist and communist political ideologies insist. Liberalism and the nation. Liberalism was engendered in Western Europe and America in the epoch of bourgeois revolutions and strengthened as Western political, religious, and social institutions that preceded the imperial feudal periods gradually weakened: monarchy, the church, estates. In its first stages, liberalism dealt with the idea of the creation of contemporary nations, when in Europe they conceived the nation as a uniform political formation founded on a contractual basis, opposing the more ancient imperial and feudal forms. The nation was understood as the totality of citizens of a state, a totality in which is embodied the relationship of a population of individuals connected by a common territorial residence and a common level of economic development. Neither ethnic nor religious nor class factors had any significance. Such a, quote, nation-state had no common historical goal and no determinate mission. It conceived of itself as a corporation or business that is founded through the reciprocal agreement of its participants and that can theoretically be dissolved on those same bases. The European nations kicked religion, ethnic identity, and classes to the curb, believing these to be remnants of the, quote, Dark Ages. This is the difference between liberal nationalism and other versions thereof. Here, no values of ethno-religious or historical communities are taken into consideration. The accent is put only on the benefits and advantages of the collective agreement of the individuals concerned, who have established a government for concrete, pragmatic reasons. The challenge of Marxism. If, with the dismantling of feudal monarchic and clerical regimes, everything was going smoothly for liberalism, and no ideological alternatives stemming from the European Middle Ages were able to oppose liberals, then in the depths of the philosophy of the modern era there appeared a movement contesting with liberals for the right to first place in the process of modernization, and coming out with a powerful conceptual critique of liberalism derived not from positions of the past, but from positions of the future. Such were socialist and communist ideas, receiving their most systematic expression in Marxism. Marx carefully analyzed the political economy of Adam Smith and, more broadly, of the liberal school, but he drew from these ideas an absolutely original conclusion. He recognized their partial correctness in comparison to feudal models of traditional societies, but he offered to go further, to refute what are for liberals the most important postulates. In liberalism, Marxism denied the identification of the subject with the individual. It recognized the unjust system of the appropriation of surplus value by capitalists in the process of a market economy. It reckoned the, quote, freedom of bourgeois society a veiled form of class supremacy, masking under new clothes the mechanisms of exploitation, alienation, and oppression. It called for a proletarian revolution and abolition of the market and private property. It pinned its hopes on aiming for the social collectivization of property. It claimed creative labor as the social freedom of the communist future. It criticized bourgeois nationalism as a form of collective violence over the poorest layers of its respective societies and as an instrument of international aggression in the name of egoistic interests of the national bourgeoisie. Thus, over 2 centuries, Marxism transformed into the most important ideological opponent and competitor of liberalism, attacking its system, and ideologically following and sometimes scoring important successes, especially in the 20th century with the appearance of a world socialist system. At a certain point, it seemed as though precisely those leftist powers would win the argument over the heritage of modernity and for the, quote, orthodoxy of the new age. And many liberals began to believe that socialism was the unavoidable future, which would correct the liberal political system and perhaps abolish it altogether. From here, the tendencies of social liberalism began, which, recognizing certain moral theses of Marxism, strove to smooth over its revolutionary potential and to combine 2 foundational ideologies of the new era at the price of rejecting their cruelest and most pointed affirmations. Revisionists on the side of Marxism, in particular right-wing social democrats, moved in the same direction from the opposite camp. The question about how to relate to socialists and leftists reached its most difficult moments for liberals in the 1920s and 30s, when the communists first proved the importance of their historical intentions and the possibility of their seizing and holding power. In this period, the neoliberal school arose, formulating a very important ideological thesis. Liberalism is not a transitional stage from feudalism to Marxism and socialism, but rather an ideology that is complete in itself, holding an exclusive monopoly on the heritage of the Enlightenment and the modern era. In this view, modernism itself is no development of Western society and Western thought, but rather a regressive return, using modernist slogans, to the feudal epoch of eschatological uprisings and millenarian cults. Neoliberals prove this by the systematic critique of the German conservative philosopher Hegel, as well as by references to the totalitarian Soviet experience, and called for a return to the roots, to Locke and Smith, standing firmly on their principles, and by criticizing social liberals for their concessions and compromises. Neoliberalism as a theory was most clearly formulated in Europe, but its large-scale realization happened in the United States, where liberalism dominated in politics, ideology, and economic practice. And although at the time of Roosevelt there were strong social liberal tendencies even in the United States, the indisputable advantage was with the liberal school. In a theoretical sense, this tendency received its greatest development in the Chicago School. After the Second World War, the decisive stage of the battle for the heritage of the Enlightenment began. Liberals supported by the United States fought the final battle with Marxism, personified by the USSR and its allies. Europe occupied the third place in the ideological war. Social liberal and social democratic tendencies prevailed there. The definitive victories of the liberals in the 1990s. The fall of the USSR and our defeat in the Cold War signified, from an ideological point of view, the final distribution of roles in the fight for the heritage of the Enlightenment and for the way of the future. Exactly on the strength of the fact that the USSR lost and fell apart, it became obvious that historical right was on the side of the liberals, especially of the neoliberals, who prevented socialism and communism from claiming the future as the progressive tomorrow. Soviet society and other socialist regimes turned out to be carefully disguised versions of archaic structures, having interpreted in their own way the mystically, religiously understood Marxism. This all-important moment in the political history of mankind first of all put the dot on the I with respect to the most important question of the times. Which of the two central ideologies of the 20th century would follow the past, the spirit of the Enlightenment, and automatically receive the future? The question of the goal of the historical process was principally settled. In the middle of the 20th century, the French philosopher, a Hegelian of Russian origin, Alexander Kojève, suggested that the Hegelian, quote, end of history would mark a communist world revolution. The traditionalists who rejected the Enlightenment, defending tradition and foretelling the end of the world through the victory of the fourth caste, thought similarly. But in 1991, with the dissolution of the USSR, it became clear that the end of history would carry not a Marxist, but a liberal form, about which the American philosopher Francis Fukuyama hurried to inform humanity, proclaiming the end of history as a planetary victory of the market, liberalism, the United States, and bourgeois democracy. Marxism as a possible alternative and project of the future became a meaningless episode of political and ideological history. From that point, there not only began the takeoff of liberalism in its most orthodox, fundamentalist, Anglo-Saxon, and anti-socialist forms, but also the laying bare of the fundamental fact of the ideological history of man. Liberalism is destiny. But this means that its thesis, its philosophical, political, social, and economic principles and dogmas should be looked at as something universal and absolute, having no alternatives. On the threshold of the American century. As a result of the political history of the 20th century, it was discovered that liberalism had won the war for contemporary times, having beaten all its opponents on both the right and the left. The huge cycle of the modern era was completed with the triumph of liberal ideology, which received henceforth a monopoly on the control and direction of historical development. Liberalism was left with no symmetrical enemy, no large-scale subject with an adequate historical self-understanding, a convincing and orderly ideology, serious material and military resources, and comparable technology, economic, and armed forces. All that still opposed liberal ideology showed itself as a chaotic collection of simple nuisances and mistakes, in a word, noises, opposing through inertia the builders of the new liberal order. This was not a rivalry of alternative civilizational and geopolitical subjects, but the reactive and passive resistance of a disorganized field. Thus, soil, rain, karstic emptiness, or marshland brothers, the builders of roads. The discussion is not about the construction of another route that another company insists on, but about the resistance of the environment. In this situation, the United States, as the citadel of world liberalism, took on a new quality. From this time on, it became not only one of two superpowers, but the single planetary hero, suddenly pulling away from its rivals. The French critic of the United States, Hubert Védrine, suggested that it should henceforth not be called a superpower, but a hyperpower, underscoring its solitariness and its asymmetrical superiority. From an ideological point of view, the victory of liberalism and the rise of the United States is not an accidental coincidence, but two sides of one and the same occurrence. The United States won the Cold War not because it amassed more potential and got ahead in the technological competition, but because it based itself on the liberal ideology, proving both its technological competence and its historical rightness in the ideological war, substantiating the balance of the modern era. And just as liberalism displayed its faded dimension, the United States received a concrete confirmation of its messianism, which, in the ideology of manifest destiny, was, since the 19th century, an article of faith for the American political elite. American neoconservatives recognized this arrangement of matters more clearly than anyone else. In the words of one of their most important ideologues, William Kristol, the 20th century was the century of America's rise, but the 21st century will be the American century. Let us consider that statement. What difference is there between the century of America and the American century? The century of America signifies that, in that period, the ideology of liberalism fought with its rivals and smashed them to bits. America, having been one of the few world powers, transformed into the only one. And now, according to the thinking of the neoconservatives, America is due to affirm the American model, the American way of life, as a world order obligatory for all. Before one's eyes, the United States stopped being a national government and became a synonym for world government. The entire planet must henceforth become a world America, world government, or world state. This is what they call the American century, the project of globalizing the American model to global proportions. This is not simply colonization or a new form of imperialism. This is a program of the total implementation of the one and only ideological system, copied from American liberal ideology. America henceforth has pretensions to the universal spreading of a unitary code which penetrates into the life of peoples and governments in 1,000 different ways, like a global network, through technology, the market economy, the political model of liberal democracy, information systems, the model of mass culture and its media products, and the establishment of direct strategic control of Americans and their satellites over geopolitical processes. The American century is thought of as a re-smelting of the existing world order into a new one, built up on strictly American patterns. This process is conditionally called democratization, and it is directed at a few concrete geopolitical enclaves that are, in the first place, problematic from the point of view of liberalism. In this way, there came to be the projects of the Greater Middle East, the Greater Central Asia, and so on. The meaning of them all consists in the uprooting of inertial national, political, economic, social, religious, and cultural models and their replacement by the operational systems of American liberalism. But it is not that important whether the discussion is about the enemies of the United States or their allies. Both friends and enemies are subject to reformatting, as are those who wish to remain neutral. This is the meaning of the American century. Liberalism, having defeated its formal enemies, penetrates completely. And now it is not enough to be on the side of the United States in local conflicts. Henceforth, liberalism must penetrate into the depths of all societies and countries without exception, and the slightest resistance will be, according to the designs of the neoconservatives, broken, as happened in Serbia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. American critics of such an approach, for instance, the paleoconservative Patrick Buchanan, declare, America acquired the whole world but lost itself. However, this does not stop neoconservatives inasmuch as they take the United States not only as a national government, but also as the avant-garde of the liberal ideology. And it was no accident that the neoconservatives emerged from Trotskyism. Just as Trotskyites sought a global communist revolution, mercilessly criticizing Stalin and the idea of building socialism in one country, contemporary neoconservatives call for a global liberal revolution, categorically rejecting the call of isolationists to limit themselves to the American borders and their historical allies. Precisely the neoconservatives, setting the tone for contemporary American politics, most deeply understand the ideological meaning of the fate of political teachings at the dawn of the 21st century. American neoconservative circles most adequately perceive the significance of the large-scale changes happening in the world. For them, ideology remains the most important subject of attention, although today it also turns into, quote, soft ideology or, quote, soft power. Liberalism and postmodernity. Having gone over from the formal opposition to the alternative ideologies to the new phase of introduction on the world scale, the liberal ideology changes its status. In the epoch of modernity, liberalism always coexists with non-liberalism, which means that it was an object of choice, like with modern computer technology, where one can theoretically select a computer with a Microsoft, Mac OS, or Linux operating system. After defeating its rivals, liberalism brought back a monopoly on ideological thinking. It became the sole ideology, not allowing any other alongside itself. One can say that it switched over from the level of a program to the level of an operating system, having become something common. Notice, coming to a store and selecting a computer, we more often than not do not say, quote, give me a computer that runs Microsoft. We simply say, give me a computer, and in accordance with our silence, we are sold a computer with a Microsoft operating system. So it is with liberalism. It is implanted in us by itself, like something standard, which it would be absurd and pointless to contest. The content of liberalism changes, switching over from the level of expression to the level of speech. Liberalism becomes not proper liberalism, but sub-audition, silent agreement, consensus. This corresponds to the switchover from the epoch of modernity to postmodernity. In postmodernity, liberalism, preserving and even increasing its influence, even more rarely projects an intelligent and freely adopted political philosophy. It becomes unconscious, self-understood, and instinctive. This instinctive liberalism, having pretenses to transform itself into the generally non-conscious matrix of contemporariness, gradually acquires grotesque characteristics. From the classical principles of liberalism, which have become unconscious, the grotesque ways of postmodern culture are born. This is already a sui generis post-liberalism, following from the total victory of classical liberalism, but leading it to extreme conclusions. Thus there arises the panorama of post-liberal grotesques. The measure of things becomes not the individual, but the post-individual, the dividual, accidentally playing an ironic combination of parts of people. Private property is idolized, transcendentalized, and transforms from that which a man owns to that which owns the man. Equality of opportunity turns into equality of the contemplation of opportunities. Belief in the contractual character of all political and social institutions grows into an equalization of the real and the virtual, and the world becomes a technical model. All forms of non-individual authorities disappear altogether, and any individual is free to think about the world howsoever he sees fit. The principle of the separation of powers transforms into the idea of a constant electronic referendum, where each internet user continually quote-unquote votes for any decision by giving his opinion in any number of forums, which in turn cedes power to each individual citizen. Civil society completely displaces government and converts into a global, cosmopolitan melting pot. From the thesis, economy is destiny, it takes up the thesis, the numerical code that is destiny, so far as work, money, the market, production, consumption, everything becomes virtual. Some liberals and neoconservatives were terrified at that prospect, which opened up as a consequence of the ideological victory of liberalism before the transition to post-liberalism and postmodernity. Thus, Fukuyama, the author of the thesis of the liberal end of history in the last decade, has called on the United States and the West to turn back and to hold over the previous phase of vintage classic liberalism with the market, the nation-state, and its customary scientific rationalism in order to avoid sliding into the post-liberal chasm. But in this, he is contradicting himself. The logic of the formation from normal liberalism to the liberalism of postmodernity is neither arbitrary nor voluntary. It is written in the very structure of the liberal ideology, in the course of the gradual liberation of man from all that which is not himself. One must sooner or later free a man from his own self. And the most frightening crisis of the individual does not begin when he is fighting alternative ideologies that deny man is the highest value, but when he attains his conclusive and irreversible victory. Liberalism in contemporary Russia. If we were to juxtapose all the aforementioned about liberalism with what is understood by liberalism in Russia, we would have to admit that there is no liberalism here. There are liberals, but no liberalism. Until the beginning of the 1990s, Marxist ideology formally dominated in Russia and raised up from childhood the outright majority of those people who, in one way or another, influence the decisions of government today. The principles of liberalism, in the first place, were foreign to the instinctive foundations of Russian society. They were severely persecuted by the ideological organs in the USSR, and were either unknown or else construed in a caricatured and fragmentary way. The sole meaning of liberalism in Russia in the 1990s was freed from Russian Soviet political economic traditions and an uncritical, ignorant, and parodic imitation of the West. Practically none of the post-Soviet elite selected liberalism consciously and deliberately until the last moment of the fall of the USSR. The leaders of Russian liberalism eulogized the Communist Party, the ideas of Marx, the plan, and socialism, while the oligarchs made a living in the committee of komsomols, or served in the KGB. Liberalism as a political ideology interested no one. Not a penny was paid for it. Such a cheap and crooked liberalism was maintained in the 1990s as an ersatz ideology for post-Soviet Russia. But instead of mastering liberal principles, its supporters and preachers engaged in careerism, privatization, and setting up their own little deals, in the best case fulfilling the guidelines of the Western caricatures of the breakdown of the Soviet and Russian state. This was an ideological disintegration of the previous structure without erecting anything new in its place at all. No one even really chose the dubious, quote, freedom from. When Putin came to power and attempted to turn the process of Russia's disintegration around, he encountered, to a large measure, no ideological opposition. He was challenged by concrete economic clans, whose interests he discerned, and the more active agency of influence, deeply entrenched in espionage in the service of the West. The absolute majority of liberals quickly transformed themselves into backers of Putin, adapting themselves under the individual patriotic sympathies of the new leader. Even iconic figures of Russian liberalism, Gaidar, Chubais, etc., behaved like banal opportunists. They could not care less about the ideological content of Putin's reforms. In Russia, irrespective of the whole period of the 1990s, liberalism did not penetrate deeply and did not spawn a political generation of authentic, convinced liberals. It operated on Russia mainly from without, which led in the end to a worsening of the relations with the United States, to the obstruction of Putin and his course in the West, and, in response, to his Munich speech. But insofar as the number of conscious liberals during the critical moments of change in Russia turned out to be not more than the number of conscious communists at the end of the 1980s, Putin did not insist on their ideological harassment, opting to control only the more unbridled of the liberal oligarchs and the direct agents of influence who became impudent through lawlessness. Intuitively striving to preserve and consolidate Russian sovereignty, Putin entered into a conflict with the liberal West and its plans for globalization, but without forming his actions into an alternative ideology. This was mostly because there were so very few convinced liberals in Russia. The real liberal is the one who acts in compliance with the fundamental principles of liberalism, including in those instances when to do so could lead to serious consequences, repressions, and even deprivation of life. If people turn out to be liberals only when liberalism is permitted, in fashion or even out of obligation, ready at the first difficulty to repudiate these principles, such quote-unquote liberalism has no relation to the real kind. It seems Khodorkovsky, the, quote, icon of contemporary Russian liberals, understood that, having spent some time in prison. But in this, it seems to me, he is an exception among the liberals who remain free. The Crusade Against the West. However much liberalism today claims that there are no alternatives, there is always a choice in human history. While man exists, he is free to choose, both what everyone chooses and what no one does. Liberalism today does not offer itself up as an option among many to prefer. It calls this decision the only one possible, and this is not a usual arbitrariness. The logic of the political history of modernity avows the validity of such an approach. Of course, one could imagine that many people on the planet came late to the awareness of what happened at the end of the 20th century and the start of the 21st century, and by inertia believe in socialism, communism, and even religion. Or maybe that someone does not accept liberalism for some other local or individual consideration. For instance, after realizing that, in such a system, he would find himself among quote-unquote losers. But this does not matter at all. All systematic and foundational alternatives are crushed, and someone's peripheral, troubled, and unintelligent dissatisfaction, plainly, in political ideological terms, affects nothing. Nevertheless, even in the new phase of its self-evident imposition, liberalism may be repudiated, and, if behind it, there stands the full might of the inertia of modernity, the spirit of the Enlightenment and the logic of the political and economic history of European humanity of the last centuries, it must be repudiated together with modernity, the Enlightenment, and European humanity all together. Moreover, only the acknowledgement of liberalism as fate, as a fundamental influence comprising the march of Western European history, will allow us really to say no to liberalism. We should repudiate it in its capacity as a global metaphysical factor, and not as a particular, accidental heresy, or as a distortion of normal development. The path that humanity entered upon in the modern era led precisely to liberalism and to the repudiation of God, tradition, community, ethnicity, empires, and kingdoms. Such a path is tread entirely logically, having decided to liberate itself from everything that keeps man in check. The man of the modern era reached his logical apogee. Before our eyes, he is liberated from himself. The logic of world liberalism and globalization pulls us into the abyss of postmodern dissolution and virtuality. Our youth already have one foot in it. The codes of liberal globalism are effectively introduced on an unconscious level through habits, commercials, glamour, technology, the media, celebrities. The usual phenomenon now is the loss of identity, and already not simply only national or cultural identity, but even sexual, and soon enough even human identity. And defenders of human rights, not noticing the tragedy of the entire peoples they are sacrificing to their cruel plan of the New World Order, will howl tomorrow about transgressions against the rights of cyborgs or clones. The people's refusal to adopt liberalism is completely understandable and can be met at every turn, but it will remain impotent and ineffective until we recognize that we are dealing not with an accident, but with something systemic. Not with a temporary deviation from the norm, but with a fatal, incurable disease, the origins of which we should seek in those periods in which to many everything seemed unclouded and clear, and humanity seemed to enter into the epoch of progress, development, freedom, and equal rights. But this was simply a syndrome of approaching agony. Liberalism is an absolute evil, not only in its factual embodiment, but also in its fundamental theoretical presuppositions, and its victory, its world triumph, only underscores and displays those most wicked qualities which earlier were veiled. Freedom from is the most disgusting formula of slavery, inasmuch as it tempts man to an insurrection against God, against traditional values, against the moral and spiritual foundations of his people and his culture. And even if liberalism won all the formal battles and brought us indeed to the cusp of an American century, the real battle is still ahead. But it takes place only after the authentic meaning of the past will be genuinely understood, when the metaphysical meaning of liberalism and its fateful victory becomes known to the right measure and the right proportions. Only tearing it out by its roots can defeat this evil, and I do not exclude that such a victory will necessitate erasing from the face of the earth those spiritual and physical halos from which arose the global heresy, which insists that man is the measure of all things. Only a global crusade against the United States, the West, globalization, and their political ideological expression, liberalism, is capable of becoming an adequate response. The elaboration of the ideology of this crusader campaign undoubtedly is a matter for Russia not to pursue alone, but together with all the world powers who, in one way or another, oppose the American century. Nevertheless, in any case, this ideology must begin with the recognition of the fatal role of liberalism, which has characterized the path of the West from the moment when it rejected the values of God and tradition. Chapter 10. The Ontology of the Future. Is there a future? The question is legitimate because it provokes thinking about the ontology of time. What is, or at least is now? Precisely because of the fact of its being now, it is considered as being proper according to the multitude of our direct, empirical perceptions. What was, or the fact of that which has existed previously, is certified by the historical record and other remnants. But in both cases, forgery or misunderstanding is possible. Therefore, the existence of what has yet to be is highly questionable at best. Martin Heidegger spoke about 3 ecstasies of time: the past, the present, and the future. Apparently, there are 3 ontological arguments relative to these 3 ecstasies. Immediacy is related to the present. Documentary is related to the past. And probabilistic is related to the future. It seems that we could create a hierarchy based on the evidence. There is
there was, there will be. There is most evident. There will be is most doubtful. There was is in the middle. The future is the most unreliable among the three ecstasies of time. The future cannot be taken into consideration to the same degree as there is or there was. There was, or at least we believe that it was from the evidence at hand. Concerning the future, you cannot know for certain. A given event or thing could happen, but most likely will not. Thus, the future lacks being compared with the other ecstasies of time. From this point, we could proceed in several different directions. For example, we could question the solidity of ontological arguments concerning the most evident moment, the present. This recalls Kant and his doubts about the inner being of the object. The fact of simply perceiving something is not enough for a definitive declaration of its being. This is the Ding an sich, or the thing in itself conundrum of Kantian philosophy. Not pure reason, but only practical reason gives being to an object. Based on the moral imperative, an object should have being. It would be good for it to have it, therefore it has to have it. If the being of the present, as the most evident of all the moments of time, can be seriously put in doubt, then we are arriving at an interesting point. All three moments of time are then ontologically unprovable and unverifiable and concern only the gnoseologic level relating to the philosophy of knowledge and the human faculty for learning. This is pessimistic concerning the present, whose reality we habitually take for granted, but is optimistic concerning the two other moments, the past and the future. The past and the future thereby acquire equal consideration with the present. From the perspective of pure reason, the present, past, and future all have equal phenomenological value. The future, in this case, is the phenomenon, and hence, phenomenologically speaking, it is. Being the phenomenon itself, the future is, and it is real. The future, therefore, is actual. Kant, analyzing the a priori forms of sensibility, puts time nearer to the subject, and space nearer to the object. It indicates that time belongs closest to the orbit of the subject. Time is hence subjective. It is the transcendental subject that installs time in the perception of the object. Now let us change the perspective and consider time phenomenologically. Husserl proposed to study time through the use of music. The consciousness of hearing the music is not based on the strict identification of notes sounding in a concrete, discrete moment. Hearing music is something different from hearing an individual note that sounds now, in the present. The consciousness of music occurs by hearing an individual note that sounds now, in the present, as well as recalling the past notes that are dissolving little by little into nothingness. However, their resonance persists in the consciousness and gives music its aesthetic sense. Husserl calls it the continuous instance. The past is present in the present. The present thus becomes continuous and includes the past as a vanishing presence. This is the methodological key for the understanding of history. History is awareness of the presence of the past in the present. The vanishing events continue to sound in the act of recalling of them. Clio and Polyhymnia, the muses of history and time respectively in Greek mythology, are sisters. This recalling is necessary to give us our sense of the present. The anamnesis of Plato has the same function. The soul should recall the hidden past of its previous lives in order to reconstruct the wholeness of the melody of destiny. Only thus could it be played harmoniously. The future should, therefore, be understood in this context. The future is continuous in the present, not the moment of novum, but the process of the fading of the present into the past. The future is the tail end of the present, its resonance. We live in the future just now, and already now, when we play the note of the melody of life. The future is the process of the death of the present, attention to the dissolution of melody into the totality of harmony. The novum appears in the future only when the harmony is lost, when our attention falls asleep, and then suddenly we awaken and cannot identify the sounds that we hear. Momentarily, they simply make no sense. That is the novum, spontaneous incomprehension of what is going on in the ecstasy of time. It is the nature of discrete, discontinuous events. It is the suspended moment of being without history, and hence without a sense of awareness and consciousness. Edmund Husserl dug much deeper into the phenomenology of time. He discovered the new instance of consciousness lying underneath the level where the nature of time, as illuminated by music, is perceived. According to Husserl, beneath this level there is another, ultimate one, which is responsible for our perception of what is now with the force of evidence and a much more intensive taste of reality that recalls the ever-dying past. This instance is consciousness itself, the consciousness as such that precedes the intentionality and the dualist nature of apprehension, being necessarily divided into two parts, the perceived and the perceiving. In the present, the consciousness perceives itself and nothing else. That is the ultimate experience of the last source of reality. According to Husserl, the foundation of all consciousness is transcendental subjectivity, from whence it conceives itself as a kind of short circuit. This experience is self-referential. In it, there is the perception of pure being as the presence of the subjectivity of consciousness. This short circuit causes all kinds of dualities to be born, the logical ones and the temporal ones. The necessity of stopping this trauma is manifest in the creation of time, the articulation of the three moments of time. Consciousness of time is necessary to hide the present, which is the traumatic experience of the self-referential nature of pure consciousness. Intentionality and logical judgments are all rooted in this evasion of the perception of the pain of the void whereby consciousness becomes aware of itself. Such an attitude to the levels of consciousness explains the origin of time as the evasion of the present, and the unbearable tension of the pure presence of the same. This tension is immediately relieved by the expansion of all the imaginable types of dualities that constitute the textures of the continuous process of time. The model of this process is the creation of the three moments of time. The logical and spatial symmetries follow. Such dualities as yes, no, true, false, high, low, right, left, here, there, and so on. Before, after belongs to the same cadence. Time constitutes consciousness running from the unbearable confrontation with itself, but this confrontation is inevitable, so the present and the high precision of its existential perception is born. What is most important in this interpretation of the morphology of time? The idea that time precedes the object, and that in the construction of time we should seek an inner depth of consciousness, rather than a consciousness rooted in outer phenomenon constituted by the subjective process of traumatic self-awareness. The world around us becomes what it is by the fundamental action of presencing accomplished by the mind. When the mind sleeps, reality lacks the sense of present existence. It is fully immersed in a continuous dream. The world is created by time, and time, in its turn, is the manifestation of self-aware subjectivity in intra-subjectivity. These remarks lead us to considerations of the future, prognostication, projection, and analysis of the future. Moving from man to society, and from anthropology to sociology, we can affirm the future as something absolutely subjective in nature, and so, in this context, it is something social. The future is social because it is a historical feature and not immanent to an object's nature. The object has no future. The earth, animals, stones, machines, all have no future. Only that which is included in the human social context can take part in the future, and then only indirectly. Without self-referential consciousness, there can be no time. Time is that which is inside us, and that which makes us what we are. Time is man's ultimate identity. This subjectivity of time does not mean that prognostication will be self-fulfilling prophecy, as per Robert K. Merton, nor that any event is realizable a priori. The future is strictly determined, not something voluntary. Time, being historical, is predefined precisely by its historical content. The subject is not free from its structure, and more than this, it is absolutely enslaved by it. Time needs the future as a void for the continuous fading of the present and, partially, of the past. Without the future, the subject will not have the space necessary to evade, running from the impossible encounter with itself from the short circuit mentioned above. The frozen moment of the present without the future is that of death. Society needs the future to run from itself further and further. The chronicle of such a run is the sense of history. Society requires a narrative of the past. The future is predefined by the structure of the subject. That is why the future is strictly defined. The subject cannot stop itself from deploying the chains of reason. It cannot not think, and cannot constitute the temporal cadences. The future is in the same measure as the present and past, where time is, and future is also. The future makes sense. It makes sense even before it happens. More than this, the future makes sense even if it will never happen. In this lies the semantic value of prophecy and prognosis. Even if it does not occur, it is also pregnant with meaning and helps explain the present. Prophecies and prognosis further help us to discern the meaning of the future. When the future refutes the expectations of prophecy and prognosis, the fact of their refutation gives sense to the future because our understanding of it consists, in part, in what was not realized. Unfulfilled prophecy has exactly the same importance as fulfilled prophecy. The future can be analyzed with the same accuracy as the present and the past. The only unique features of the future are the flash of the encounter of the deepest consciousness with itself, and the intensive shock that results from a conscious understanding of the present for what it is. What the present is the note that sounds now, but it is not music, and can be analyzed. The isolated note says nothing. It conveys nothing to us. It is understandable only by taking into consideration and in the context of the other notes of the particular piece of music. The context gives it sense. So, in the content of time, it is something whole that is disposed a priori in the 3 moments of time. We experience time in its totality. Therefore, the future is already laid out with the sense of music. History is not only our memory of the past, it is also the explication of the present and the experience of the future. When we understand history and its logic well, we can easily guess what will follow, what is going to happen, and which note should come next. Knowing society, we could identify in its history the harmony, the periods, the refrains, and the structure of the piece. Of course, we could encounter surprises, but most surprising would be the possibility of one authentic moment of experiencing the self-knowledge of pure consciousness. It is possible to be awoken by the strength of this inner light of self-reflection. In this traumatic situation, we discover our identity between the most inner and outer levels of our consciousness. We live in the creation of the external world by the internal self. But that is no longer history. It is breaking through history, an intrusion to the center of time, where time is eternally being constructed. Time springs from this point. There it exists in the undifferentiated unity of all 3 ecstasies, past, present, and future. Time can be constructed and organized in different ways. The past can be connected with the present and with the future by different links. This circular time is based on an eternal refrain pattern. In the center of circular time, there is the experience of consciousness linked to itself in the manner of a short circuit. The power of this trauma rejects our awareness of life and banishes it to the periphery, where it becomes circular time, where the future becomes the past, and so on for eternity. It is the eternal return of the same. Time can be organized as a regressive line, traditional time. Here, the experience of the short circuit is placed in the past. The ear tries to capture the distant sounds of the past and truly reproduce it. In traditional society, time is based on the everlasting effort of Platonic anamnesis. Most important here is memory and transmission. In this organization of time, the future and the present are constructed by the past. Reality and actuality regress into the past and are consigned to memory. Time can also be constructed as the perpetual state of waiting for the future. This is chiliastic or messianic time. Here, the short-circuit experience is projected into the future. History is going to fulfill itself in the future, where the ultimate nature of reality lies. This organization of time is centered on that which is to come. Tomorrow is the focus of the historical sense. Being is oriented to future life. There is another construction of time installed in the object, which is moved to the extreme periphery of the subject, where the objective world is fixed. This organization of time is material time, time introduced in the substance of the physical world. This is the time of slaughter, of the death of the subject. Consciousness can construct different forms of time and their combinations. Before creating the world filled with forms, the subject creates the form of time where the world is to be. The histories of different societies are different. Different, too, are the pieces, the musicians, the composers, the instruments, the musical genre, and the types of notation used by them. That is why humanity as a whole cannot have a future. It has no future. To speak of the future of humanity is quite senseless because it completely lacks semantic value, as well as the sense of these different societal constructions of history and time. Every society is a separate act of consciousness, expanded in the rational and temporal horizons. All are unique and open, but before coming to an understanding of the history of a given society, we should immerse ourselves in the depths of its identity. The fact that every people, every culture, every society has its own history makes time a local phenomenon grounded in geography. Every society possesses its own temporality. For a given society, all the moments of time are different, past, present, and future. Societies can cross and intersect, cross-pollinate and interact. Their sense of history, however, cannot. History is local. A shared sense of history is possible only on the basis of the domination of one society over another, and imposing its own history and, thus, its identity on the enslaved one. That means if a given society is to have a future, it must be its own future. Its future is formed through appurtenance to the expanding forces of the constituent subject. A society is united through the structures of the collective consciousness of the individuals that comprise it. It means we should unite the semantic ranges of our respective pasts. Further, it means that in order to prove the harmonious correspondences of the notes and melodies of our own particular musical piece, the symphonic nature of a given society must be realized. The past is fading, but never extinguished. If the past were extinguished, the present would lose its sense, and the future the possibility of occurring. The fading of the past is an essential characteristic of time. The fading of the past is necessary for the morphology of time at the same level as the flash of the present and the vagueness of the future. Therefore, the members of a society should ask themselves today about their future. If they have a history, they could have a future. If they have both a history and a future, they are. If they are, the future is implicit, now, in the present. The future is being made now. On this basis, we can establish both prognosis and projection. According to Heidegger, thrownness, or Geworfenheit, is a concept that describes the interactions of the subject with its surroundings in everyday life that cause it to act upon instincts, form immediate reactions to other people's language and actions, flow with the situation, and make immediate interpretations. Being thrown into a situation without being able to reflect on it first, and therefore not acting, is also an action, for reflection on the situation is also something that can be interpreted as an action. One therefore must rely on instinctual interpretations and go with the flow. The thrownness of the subject forces it to project itself into the future. Etymologically, it is clear. The subject is formed by subjectum, projection, by projectum. In both cases, we have the Latin verb to throw. The analysis of the future is rooted in this. By apprehending the future, we are making it. Therefore, any consideration of the future is to work on history and the consciousness of time as such. It is doubtful that one society is capable of comprehending another society at the same level as it is comprehended by its own members. Such a possibility presupposes the existence of the meta-society, the society God, which could operate with the ultimate depths of consciousness in the same manner as consciousness operates with awareness, gnosis, intentionality, logic, time, and finally with the world. Obviously, Western society is particularly afflicted with such an ethnocentric approach and, quote, universal pretensions rooted in its racist and colonialist past. But in the 20th century, this was proven to be completely unfounded and false. Structuralists, sociologists, cultural anthropologists, postmodernists, phenomenologists, linguists, existentialists, and so on, have all deployed convincing arguments demonstrating that the inner nature of such an attitude is rooted in the will to power and paranoid imposition of one's own identity on the other. This illness is called Western racism. The West is a local and historical phenomenon. It is a very acute civilization, very particular, very arrogant, and very smart. But it is just one civilization among many others. The West has history, and is because of its history. The attempt to abdicate this history in favor of pure universalism and in favor of metaculture and meta-language is doomed. There are two possible outcomes of this. One, either the West loses its own identity and will turn into an automation, or two, it will try to impose its own history, conceived by itself as being universal, on all the other existing civilizations, destroying them in the process and creating a new kind of global concentration camp for their cultures. The first outcome implies a struggle of automations with humanity. The second implies an inevitable global liberation movement struggling against this neo-imperialism. It is for the West to decide how to manage the consequences of its proper history and its implications. The West can try to close its history, but it is unlikely that it will succeed in closing the history of all the others. Now is the moment to begin the fight for the historical being of societies. This historical being is time, the sense of which is constituted subjectively. This sense can reside only in a given society itself. Time is socially and subjectively constructed. The West cannot intersect with the sense of non-Western societies. The non-Western societies, i.e. the quote-unquote rest, cannot correctly understand the West and its values. They are in continuous error thinking that they can. It is false. They cannot. But, likewise, Western people cannot understand the rest. The structures of the subjects, its sense of time, and its music are all different. The past, the present, and the future of historical societies cannot be exposed by any metaculture. They are lying too deep and are defended from foreign eyes by the destructive might of the self-referential moment, by the shock of this great tension. What for the West is, for the other cultures it is not. So, we are dealing with different conceptions of time and with different futures. At last, we have come to the end of history and globalization. The end of history is the logical conclusion of universalism. The end of history is the abolition of the future. History proceeds and reaches its terminal state. There is no more space to go on. By abolishing the future, the entire structure of time, such as the past and the present, are also abolished. How can this be possible? We could compare it to the simultaneous playing of all existing notes, sounds, and melodies of a musical piece, resulting in a cacophony, the gnashing and grinding of teeth. At the same time, it will provoke absolute silence, deafness, and sourness. Hence, there will be no space for the temporalization of the inner tension of transcendental subjectivity. The short circuit would grow exponentially without the possibility of being dissipated. That means the igniting of a conflagration, the same fire that usually goes hand in hand with the sword. In order to prevent the blaze and the clashing of swords that would result from closing the temporal and logical relief valve, the world will strive to trap consciousness in networks and virtuality, where it can run away from the inner pressure of self-awareness without issue. If it succeeds, the new world of the machine kingdom will be created. The global networks and cyberspace are suitable only for the existence of post-humans, post-society, and post-culture. Instead of fire, we will get lightning and electricity. Some people believe Fukuyama is already a robot. Globalization is equivalent to the end of history. Both go hand in hand. They are semantically linked. Different societies have different histories. That means different futures. If we are going to make a tomorrow common to all societies existing on the planet, if we are going to propose a global future, then we need first to destroy the history of those other societies, to delete their pasts, to annihilate the continuous moment of the present, virtualizing the realities that are constructed by the content of historical time. A common future means the deletion of particular histories, but this means that no histories at all, including their futures, will exist. The common future is no future. Globalization is the death of time. Globalization cancels out the transcendental subjectivity of Husserl and the Dasein of Heidegger. There would be neither any more time nor being. We must deal with the bifurcation of temporal constructions. It is time to address this question with all its implicit weight. Now, on the eve of the end of history, the edge of the descent into post-history, we could make the decision to give different ontological responses. When we construct the future, it should not be global in scope. It cannot be just one future. We must have many futures. The transcendental subjectivities, cultures, and societies can preserve space for the scattering of energies born of the encounter with oneself. The short circuit in question through its temporalization that will grant the existence of the outer world and the continuing of local histories. Time will continue, and the world as the experience of real presencing will be supported by the structure of the deep subjectivity. History will remain local. The common history will be a symphony of the different music of local histories being created by the unique chronological rhythms of time, and not one part attempting to drown out and overwhelm the rest until it is the only sound that can be heard. The question is, does the formalization of the nation-state correctly and exhaustively reflect the structure of the transcendental subject as the creator of history? Will future historical time necessarily be national, or will it be expressed in other ways? Maybe it will return to pre-modern forms. When Huntington evokes civilizations, he admits the possibility of emergent localities and local identities being different from the existing, manufactured nation-states. Civilizations are cultural and religious communities, not ethnic national ones. We could imagine a step backward in the pre-national direction, or a step forward in the post-national direction, or we could tolerate other civilizations in the form of nation-states. The historical narratives and the way in which politics formalizes time could be changed. It means there is a lot of work that should be done, historically speaking. While someone is alive, he can change not only the future, but also the past. The gesture or meaningful action accomplished in the present will add a new sense to the past. Only after death does one's past become the property of another. Hence, the history of peoples, societies, and cultures is open. They have the possibility to make the amazing turn that is necessary to view their past from a new perspective. So, history is music and the work of the muses. Are civilizations destined to clash with each other? It is not written in stone. History lacks linear rules. Difference does not automatically necessitate clash and struggle. Of course, history knows war, but history knows peace as well. War and peace have always existed. War and peace will always be. They serve to relieve the tension and the stress of the present. They liberate and subjugate horror and death. Total war and total peace are equally murderous. The continuation of the history of local societies instead of a single historical narrative will lead to the preservation of being, and hence to the possibility for the future to happen. The second option is globalization. It cancels the future. It requires the arrival of post-humanity. It constructs the post-world consisting of simulacra and virtual structures. In place of the transcendental subject, Dasein, society becomes a huge computer center, a matrix, a supercomputer. In place of time, it creates simulacrums of the past, present, and future. The simulacrum of the past is false memory, the product of artificial influence rewriting historical memory. The walling off of the transcendental subject allows the past to be changed as if it were a pirated DVD. An alternate version of society could be loaded as a prequel. Such a substitution of the past is technically possible. Sufficient control over the present allows the past to be easily rewritten. The substitution of the future follows from this manipulation. Two desperate tracks mixed and played over each other produce cacophonic repercussions in the future. The future is petrified, and the semantics of time blur, fork, and multiply. Manipulating the present is a little more complicated and requires a higher degree of sophistication. To remove the present, the transcendental subjectivity must not only be walled off, but eradicated. This presumes the transition from the human to the post-human. Developments in the Human Genome Project, cloning, advances in robots, and new generations of cyborg all bring us close to the advent of post-humanity. The goal of this process is to produce creatures that will lack an existential dimension with zero subjectivity. Simulacrums can be made not only out of reason, but also from unconsciousness. The most important facet of this process is the abolition of the present. Such post-human creatures and inanimate objects, animals, vehicles, plants, stones, and so on, have no sense of the present. If globalization continues, what is the fate of subjectivity? What is the ontology of the future that will, probably, never happen? A fairly unorthodox theory could be suggested. Let us assume that multipolarity is stillborn, that history has ended, and that the project of globalization has become a reality. How will the final exorcism of transcendental subjectivity be performed? How will the final decision concerning the abolition of Dasein be implemented? After all, as long as mankind and society exist, they should make this decision for themselves. It is impossible to make an appeal to the outer which could be blamed or praised for the decision and its results. Such a reference to the other is acceptable only when the self and the other are one and the same. If we lose our identity, we will also lose alterity, the capacity for otherness, and thus the ability to distinguish between self and not self, and consequently to assume the existence of any alternative viewpoint. So we are the authors of the end of history which concerns ourselves and no one else. Thus, having excluded the presence of the other, An explanation is still required about how man can accomplish the last gesture of self-destruction. How can he transfer the initiatives of existence to the post-human world, a world that will disappear immediately upon the expiration of the last man, for there will be no one left to bear witness? This is a great problem, and it requires an even deeper insight into the structure of the transcendental subject that generates time and its formulations. Nobody else can make decisions about how to reset time or to end it, an end that can only be brought about by ourselves through a final self-immolation by the exaltation of the short circuit. Hence, the subject carries within itself the possibility of such a chronicide. Globalization and the end of history cannot be reduced to the will of someone other than he who is the source of the creation of time, at least not within the limits of immanent philosophy. Consequently, this can mean only one thing, that within the depths of transcendental subjectivity, there lies another layer which Husserl had not uncovered. Husserl was convinced that the layer he discovered was the last one, but it turns out that this is not so. There has to be another dimension yet to be found, the most hidden one. We can designate it as the radical subject. If Husserl's transcendental subjectivity constitutes reality through the experience of a manifestation of self-awareness, the radical subject is to be found not on the way out, but on the way in. It itself is shown only in the moment of ultimate historical catastrophe, in the traumatic experience of the short circuit, which is stronger and lasts for a moment longer than it is possible to endure. The same experience that makes the transcendental subjectivity manifest itself and deploy its content, thus creating time with its intrinsic music, is regarded by the radical subject as an invitation to reveal itself in another manner on the other side of time. For the radical subject, time, in all its forms and configurations, is nothing more than a trap, a trick, a decoy, delaying the real decision. For the radical subject, it is not only virtuality and the electronic networks which are the prison, but reality itself has already become so, a concentration camp, an agony, and a torture. The slumber of history is something contrary to the condition where the radical subject could exist, complete itself, and become. The creation of subjectivity, being the secondary formation of temporality, is an obstacle for its realization. If we accept the hypothesis of the radical subject, we immediately confront an instance that explains who has made the decision in favor of globalization, the suicide of humanity, and the end of history. Who has conceived this plan and made it reality? It can only therefore be the drastic gesture of the radical subject, looking for liberation from time through the construction of non-temporal reality. The radical subject is incompatible with all kinds of time. It vehemently demands anti-time based on the exalted fire of eternity transfigured in the radical light. When everybody has gone, the only thing that remains is those who cannot be gone. Perhaps that is the reason for this greatest of all probations.